Hi, everyone. I'm Erik Brynjolfsson. Welcome to the Stanford Digital Economy Lab lunch seminar series. Today, we're very lucky to have Professor Riitta Katila. She's a professor of management science and engineering here at Stanford and the research director of the Stanford Technology Ventures program. Her research is at the intersection of technology, strategy, and organizational learning. And today she's going to discuss some joint work on antitrust enforcement against a dominant platform and complementary value creation and capture, called the Wild Wild West. And this is joint work with Shruti Thatchin-Carey, who I believe will be joining us for the Q&A portion. So welcome, Riitta, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Erik.
Well, actually, sorry, one more thing I wanted to mention. Sorry to interrupt, Riitta. For folks who'd like to ask questions, we are using Slido, so you can ask your questions there. I encourage you to go ahead and type your questions as they come up, and I will moderate that, and we'll do the questions, take the questions towards the second part of the meeting. But please feel free to start typing your questions, and for that matter, upvoting questions right away. So sorry for the interruption, Riitta, but you can take it away now.
Awesome, great. Great to see many of you here. Welcome, thanks to Erik for organizing Digital Economy Lab. Great to have the community together. So today, in the next 30 minutes or so, we will talk about the link between competition regulation, antitrust in particular, and whether pushing for more regulation could drive increases in novelty and innovation in an industry. My co-author is Shruti Thatchin-Carey from UCL in London, my former PhD student who graduated from the Stanford Technology Ventures program, STVP, a few years ago. Shruti will join, as Erik mentioned, the Q&A portion of the hour today. We are both strategy scholars. We approach the question of dominant platforms and regulation, why or why not, from the strategy lens. This project pulls pretty heavily from what started as Shruti's dissertation here at STVP, and we will bring back your favorite antitrust flashback, which is the Microsoft case from the early 2000s. The big question we want to ask today is, if we reduce the power of dominant platforms, a question that is much in the news today, do we indeed get more innovation and more variety? So do antitrust enforcement and more innovation go hand in hand as promised? This is very much work in progress. Other parts of this project are forthcoming in the journal Organization Science in early 2021. But today the talk is new, ongoing work, and we welcome your comments and ideas and reflections. So why this paper and this project? Our focus, as I mentioned, is on regulatory interventions that target dominant platforms. So think Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, and many other antitrust cases that have popped up in just the last 6 months, or in the last few years or so, both in the United States and in the European Union against these dominant platforms. Simply put, today we ask whether the intent of regulation is fulfilled. In other words, should we expect to see more alternatives and more innovation emerge after we put on a harness, so to speak, on a dominant firm? So can we open up more possibilities for more firms to engage with innovation in a particular market by regulating it? To give you a little bit of a more context of where we are going today, so some recent examples of antitrust regulation include Google here on the slide. Just a few years ago, 2018, fined in Europe for bundling complements, in this case, its own apps with the mobile platform that is tying its search and Chrome apps on Android mobile devices. And when you read the reasoning by regulators, the fine print and the long documents, in this case and in many other cases that we have looked through, the statements almost always point to innovation as the motivator for regulation. And specifically that dominant platforms seem to be blocking innovation in complementary markets. So it was the case in 2018 in this European Commission statement, and again in 2019 in this case. So again, we talk about denying the other competitors the possibility to compete and to innovate. So innovation seems to be at the heart of motivation of these antitrust cases. So we are blocking innovation by having these dominant platforms. So here, my final example to get us situated today is a more recent case in point, October 2020, and perhaps even more relevant to our data analysis, what we're showing to you today, is when Slack, your favorite workplace communications app, is blaming Microsoft in Europe for bundling Microsoft's own workplace communications app Teams with Microsoft's dominant platform in order to keep businesses from trying out Slack, and Microsoft thus giving more eyeballs to Teams, its own app, by bundling Teams with the platform. So point is, again, that is dominant platform, in this case Microsoft, is accused again for blocking competition and blocking innovative other approaches for solving customers' communication problems. The case, the Slack versus Microsoft Teams case is more relevant, most relevant for us today, because Microsoft, of course, was also the defendant in perhaps the biggest antitrust case against a tech company in the last half century ago, or at least it took a long time. This was colloquially known as the browser wars of the late 1990s and very early 2000s, which is the antitrust case that we're analyzing in our data today. So this new case, the Slack versus Microsoft Teams, is sort of a deja vu, as Slack is saying in their filing, pointing that Microsoft is reverting to past behavior and creating this potentially weak product and tying it to the dominant platform. And again, the idea is that a dominant platform potentially is blocking innovation by other firms, these complementary firms. So our topic today, we're looking at whether weakening the power of dominant firms, in other words, the intent of adding more competition to a market, and increases in innovation and creativity go hand in hand. It's again very timely. It's a timely topic. However, when we start looking at as academics in light of prior research work, we really do not know whether these regulatory interventions, antitrust, whether they work as promised. So the interesting dilemma, if you look at prior work, is that dominant platforms, yes, they may block other firms' innovation because they're powerful, but they may also, these dominant platforms may also bring, so to speak, order to these markets and reduce wasteful duplication of similar products and similar firms. So if you put these two things together, so if you open up markets for more competition, kind of let all flowers bloom, does it mean that also there will be lots of wasteful duplication and then no one will profit? And if this is the case, then if you backtrack, does it actually lower the incentives for firms to start innovating in the market because they may preempt that they will not profit? So the answer, whether antitrust, whether adding more competition by regulation to the markets, and then potentially getting more innovation, the answer to that equation is not straightforward. And here's where we come in today with the data. So here's our paper in one slide. So the overarching question is, do dominant platforms block innovation? In other words, if we reduce the power of dominant platforms, do we indeed get more innovation and more variety? So our setting is the regulatory shock that I mentioned in early 2000s, 2001 in particular, that aimed to add competition to software markets. It was the Microsoft trial and then the settlement in 2001. It tried to put a harness on dominant Microsoft platforms both platforms on the consumer side and on the enterprise side. So our specific focus today, the data that we'll show, is on one specific complementary market to Microsoft's dominant enterprise server platform. We're looking at enterprise infrastructure software complementary firms and how innovation of these firms that directly competed with Microsoft's own complementary product, the innovation of these firms was influenced by this regulatory shock that tried to weaken the platform. So for those who don't know our setting, enterprise infrastructure software is probably the biggest industry you've never heard of. So this is the invisible backbone of enterprise computing. It's used to maintain critical IT assets in a corporation, think cybersecurity systems management. We will do a focused data deep dive, looking at the data from this particular segment and analyze it and show you results of what happened to innovation in this segment after Microsoft was regulated. Okay, now comes the spoiler alert. What we find is that antitrust case, this particular one in 2001, drives innovation, but it also hurt profits. So regulating Microsoft, the dominant enterprise server platform at the time, increased innovation by complementors, but it hurt profitability of them and also of Microsoft. So point is that antitrust regulators may have been effective in a sense that weakening the dominant firm's ability to block competition in complementary markets sparked new opportunities for complementary firms, and they took incentive and they did start innovating. So there's a social benefit if you think about antitrust, because innovation went up. But you could also, looking at the results, come to the conclusion that disrupting the order of an industry also led to losses in efficiency. There were duplication of effort and no one profits afterwards. So that's the big bottom line of our results. Very quick visual of who is the platform. What is the dominant platform that we're trying to regulate here, and who is the complementer in our data? So this is enterprise software, not consumer, not at home, but enterprise software. Just as a reminder, so on the right-hand side of this graph, it's grayed out. Those are the more familiar Microsoft Windows platforms on the user side. We're still enterprise users, so those are the user platforms. If you're old enough to remember, this is the time when all of us had Microsoft Windows installed on our desktops. So over the browser wars and this Microsoft case in 2001 that we're analyzing is most commonly associated with this user side on the right. This side is pretty messy to analyze. We are not there today. Instead, our data are from the left-hand side of this graph, which is also a huge significant market. This is enterprise infrastructure. Here, Microsoft's enterprise server platform is the dominant one, held 51% market share, was much bigger than anybody else in terms of server platforms at the time, was also strategically extremely important growth market for Microsoft. At the time, Microsoft had also entered several of the complementary markets to this server platform, but not others, which, as you will see later, gives us useful variation that we can use to analyze the case. So we can kind of get treated and control firms. Okay, so before we step through the data that we have and what happened in the case and show you these results, I want to briefly revisit what prior work has found, a relation between competition and innovation. Obviously, a well-examined question in economics, in strategy, many other fields. Nick Bloom and Heidi Williams have a pretty useful paper, great overview in a recent paper, so I don't go into detail here. But their big conclusion is that looking back at work of regulation, competition, and innovation, if we look at the evidence from regulatory shocks that have increased competition, and they're looking especially the international trade, such as when China entered WTO, and so increased competition, for example, in many European markets. What Nick and Heidi are saying is the main finding is that increased competition mostly drives also increases in innovation. So that's sort of good news if you think if you're a regulator. Another example, just to give you a few examples, regulation of utilities. Delmas and colleague also found that when regulators added competition, in this case in public utilities in the US, investments in novel green technologies went up. So again, it seems that competition regulation, adding competition, increasing competition, encouraging it in markets and innovation go hand in hand. So competition seems to boost innovation. But if you look at this prior work, most of the data and most of the results come from manufacturing industries. They come from public utilities. What we really know much less about is whether these same patterns hold when we move to technology-based firms, technology-intensive industries, and specifically this recent interest on dominant technology platforms. Does regulation work? Should we expect it to work the same way? So there is some new, very recent work on dominant technology platforms and competitive repositioning that has started to look at this question of more technology-focused industries and platforms, and whether dominant platforms potentially kill competition and innovation. However, if you look at this work, most of this work looks at the reverse question, the opposite question. So they look at removing or pruning competition when the dominant platform enters a complementary market. And they ask questions such as whether entrance of the platform into a particular complementary market then reduces incentives to innovate. And Feng Zhu and co-authors have very useful, great papers that show that this indeed happens. So for example, Android app developers shift their strategies in response to anticipated entry by Google. So when their entry threat by Google is higher, the entry threat by the dominant platform is higher, app developers shift their innovation efforts or minimize them away from markets where Google is. So the bottom line is that while there's much good work happening in this space right now, what we do not know is what happens when we add competition. So in a platform setting, when we add competition as antitrust aims to do, what should we expect to happen to innovation? So just very quick visual of this prior work. So when a dominant platform work, think Google or Microsoft, the examples I gave earlier, if that platform work more strongly also starts competing in a complementary market, like Chrome apps or Teams app that I mentioned as examples, they're indicated with red color in this graph. What happens to innovation? Prior work finds that innovation, or at least the incentives to innovate in the complementary market, go down for everyone. What we don't know is the reverse case, is what happens when antitrust reduces this bright red color. So I go pink here saying, now the dominant platform's power is weakened. So the threat of the platform goes down, for example, through antitrust. We are increasing competition in the complements, for example, making bundling illegal. So do we get more innovation? We don't know. Which leads us to our research question today, which is, how is antitrust intervention against a dominant firm related to innovation in the ecosystem in general, the complementers, and also what happens to the platform firm itself? If you wanted to break up this research question further in elements, you could be asking, what happens to innovation to complementary firms, the other firms? What happens to the platform, the dominant firm itself, and to its competition? A related question to ask is, what happens to profits of these firms? What happens to profits of complementary firms, these other firms? And what happens to profits to the platform firm itself? And those questions are, we will give you some answers from infrastructure software to all of these questions today. So let's start looking at our method. So the antitrust shock that we are focusing on to increase competition that we study is the Microsoft case, was settled in 2001. So in this case, the US Department of Justice accused Microsoft of using its dominant power, the monopoly power, in several platforms to block competition of complementary applications. And tactics that were referred to were, for example, bundling the platform with its Microsoft's own complements. So that's the focal case of interest today. And just like the examples of Google and the cases that Google is going through in Europe, we looked in the beginning of today. Well, Google was the dominant mobile platform and also had its own apps like Chrome that it was bundling with platform. And the main motivation for the cases was innovation. Again, if you look back to the Microsoft case in 2001, that is our focus today, prominently again, the reasoning for the case refers back to dominant platform blocking innovation. So innovation was the central motivation for this case. And consistent from this motivation, this is an interesting find. New York Times just a year ago, Rebecca Henderson, who was one of the witnesses in the case, reflected back on this Microsoft 2001 case, saying that the case was always about threat to future innovation. So the point is that the case is an especially appropriate setting for us today because we are interested in competition, regulation, and impact on innovation. Here's again a visual of our empirical design. Microsoft is the dominant server platform that we're focusing on, and Microsoft also had products in some of the complementary markets. So if you're looking at the visual, the two ones on the left, developer tools and database management, were markets where Microsoft also participated, not to the two complementary markets, but it did not have products in the three others. So Microsoft was in developer tools and database management, but not in network and systems management, nor in security or applications integration. Okay, and we are using this variation, complementary markets where Microsoft participated or not, and argue that reducing Microsoft's threat through this antitrust case should affect more strongly those complementary markets and innovation in those complementary markets where Microsoft participated. And we should see less effect or no effect on those markets, the three on the right, where it did not participate. So we're using this variation of where Microsoft had complements or not for our research design. And here is basically just a few details about why we chose infrastructure software. As I mentioned earlier, Microsoft, the server operating system, is the dominant platform, huge market share. Everybody else was about 10%, 20%. So there weren't any other dominant platforms in the space. And if you, again, we read the case on Microsoft, and the case includes numerous allegations involving infrastructure software markets. Again, the spotlight was on browser wars and the consumer-facing side and the apps there, but the case itself consisted much of actions that meant to harm infrastructure firms that are in our sample, and how they limited compatibility with the Windows, the dominant platform, etc., and bundling of Windows Server with Microsoft's own products. So again, although the spotlight publicity was on browser wars, the case is very, very appropriate for us to focus on what we want to do in enterprise infrastructure software today. Okay, so again, here are our treatment and control groups. So firms are treated if they're infrastructure markets in which Microsoft had top 5 products by market share, and then the 3 others where Microsoft was not prominent. And we are using diff in diff as our causal inference strategy, so we can find a comparable group of firms, the treaty firms and counterfactual control firms that are otherwise similar but did not go through this treatment. And we have all kinds of other fancy empirical econometric strategies that my co-author is expert on, given her econ background. I'm not going to go into details in the talk today because I want to make sure we have time for discussion, and Shruti can also join us in the Q&A portion. But we have all of your matching strategies that you can imagine. We also are using synthetic controls, which is a pretty neat technique. We have a situation where we're interested in innovation by Microsoft itself, the dominant firm, and by profits of Microsoft. So we have only one treated firm in that case. So we are using synthetic controls in that situation, using the other public big IT firms as to form this comparable group of counterfactuals and forming that synthetic Microsoft. So that's on the method side of things. So what do we have here? Our data is a full population of public infrastructure software firms, these complements in the US. Typical of this sector, many of the firms are in the Bay Area. And we are only focusing on the firms that were not diversified into non-infrastructure software. So we're trying to keep the pool of firms comparable. And we're looking at these firms both before and after the case. And we also did interviewing in this sector to help ground our analysis. And I should mention that many of the firms in this sector, as is typical of software, are in the Bay Area. How do we measure innovation? That is our outcome variable. So we use patterns that by the time of the case had become pretty standard in software. We also have alternative measures with mostly consistent results. We don't find the same results for products, which I think is consistent with our big story, but our main results are consistent with patterns, with non-citation weighted patterns, R&D intensity. So pretty robust results overall. We also measuring using another second dependent variable, profitability, using return on sales, and have some other robust measures for that second variable of interest. Statistical methods, pretty standard, won't go in detail here. So I think let's move on and look at what we actually found. So what did we find? So this is a just big overall visual before I show you the definitive graphs and some details. So big headline is that when Microsoft was regulated, patenting by complementers in our setting, the infrastructure software complementers, their patenting went up, while Microsoft's own patenting did not experience much changes in comparison with that synthetic control group. So competition and antitrust, in our case, in our data, seems to drive innovation. The second big result is that, again, when Microsoft was regulated, everybody's profits went down, both for complementers and for Microsoft's own profits. So let me show you a few visuals of these results. So I have results in two ways. So the first set of results is difference in differences results of the actual treated and actual control firms. So the control firms being the counterfactual comparison firms that did not go through the treatment. So we're not in those Microsoft's complementary markets. And we, like I said, we're adding matching to make these two groups even more comparable. So here you can see that the treated firms, those complementers that also had Microsoft as a direct competitor, those are in red. So treated firms are in red. So those complementary firms that directly competed with Microsoft in infrastructure software experienced reduction in the threat from the platform due to this antitrust craze in 2001. So after the case, if you look at the graph, after the case, the treated firms patenting went up as we predicted, and control firms that are in green, they stayed about at the same level. And to put this result a little bit more in context, traded firms that had direct threat from Microsoft competition from the platform that could use, for example, bundling to its advantage, those traded firms had on average about 7 more patent counts per year than the control firms after the trial. So this is a pretty significant impact on the innovation of these firms that were now sort of under weaker threat from Microsoft. Okay, we could play around with the control group and still get the same results. So same intuition of the results here. We're using a synthetic control group for these traded firms. We get exactly the same trends. So again, the red traded firms, they're the firms that were now faced less threat from Microsoft. Their innovation went up, so all flowers are blooming, so to speak. For the control firms, their innovation, their patenting stayed about at the same level or maybe even went down. And if you just want to look at the numbers, here are the average numbers, just the descriptive results showing the average patenting for traded firms. Again, traded firms experience a sharper increase in patenting after the case compared to the control group. So the point is the very broad brush result. It seems that antitrust is working to increase innovation. If you wanted to take a very broad interpretation of the results. So those were the results on innovation. Let's move on and look at what happened to profitability. So we also analyzed relation to profitability and the complementary firms, the traded firms. Again, the traded firms are here in red and the comparison, the control firms are in green color. The reasoning that I mentioned earlier is that you have this repositioning. Now, yes, the market is wide open because Microsoft's power is less, so everybody can now compete, but you have to reposition your product. That is costly. And if we get more innovation, there may now be wasteful duplication because everybody is entering this new market that is getting to be more widely open because the dominant firm has less power. So it's harder probably because everybody is duplicating and having the same effort. It may be harder to reap profits. So this actually seems to be correct. Again, a very broad brush interpretation. So traded firms in red color look like they have slower profit growth after the case, using both the actual control firms here in green, and again, if we are looking at the synthetic controls. And we get the same sort of results when we just look at the raw data. So taking all of these results together, what we find is that in infrastructure software, after the Microsoft trial, after the antitrust, innovation went up as we were hoping, but profits went down. The final results that I want to share with you is what happened to Microsoft itself, the dominant platform, the dominant enterprise server platform. So constructing a control for Microsoft is tricky, as I mentioned before. We just have one firm, a huge firm. We use synthetic controls of other comparable big public IT firms. It's not perfect, but it's a good try. Bottom line is that Microsoft did not learn to innovate better after the case, and its profit stalled, which may or may not be good wherever you stand. So again, the dominant platform didn't improve its innovation and nobody's profiting. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the findings of our study. So again, we get more innovation from the complementary firms. There are more approaches, there are more variety. At the same time, the question is, how should we think about the results that the profits go down for everybody, and why is that so? So the contributions, how do we contribute? So the data that we showed and shared with you today suggests, first of all, for antitrust regulation, the data suggests that intervention against a dominant platform can potentially be effective. Of course, we are interpreting the results in the context of our infrastructure software firms, so we don't know about generalizability, but it seems promising that this antitrust regulation seems to boost innovation for complementary firms in comparison to those comparable firms that were not treated. Okay, but what we also find at the same time is that profits are reduced, and this is at least in the short term. We are of course looking at only a few years before and after the treatment. Overall, then, if we take both of these results together, our results seem to suggest a potential social benefit to antitrust. We get more innovation, but if we look at the profitability results, does it really incentivize firms to enter if they know they won't profit? For competitive repositioning literature, we contribute by showing that the reduced competitive threat from a dominant firm seems to spur innovation by other firms, but at the same time, it creates this wild west kind of setting where newly constrained dominant firms are potentially less able to impose discipline that would potentially promote efficiency, and we may getting this wasteful duplication as a result. So those were our results and our data that I wanted to share, and now I wanted to turn it back to Erik to see what questions we want to discuss in the remaining time that we have together. And like I said, this is work in progress, so I'm eager to hear your questions and ideas and suggestions.
Thanks so much, Riitta. And I believe Shruti can also join us and with the Q&A. There are several questions in Slido. I encourage anyone else who wants to add questions to go ahead and pop over there and type in your questions. Let me take the first one was from your colleague, our colleague, Chuck Easley, who references a working paper by Hyung Khan that's also looking at innovation, possibly some different results. I don't know if Chuck, if you're there, if you want to just, maybe you can ask it out loud. I'm not sure that will work. If not, I can read it. Are you able to do that, Chuck? No. Okay, so.
I actually know the paper, so we can jump right in. Oh, there is Chuck. Maybe he can ask.
You want to be, yes, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah. So I'm not deeply familiar with the paper, but I know they look at 461 different antitrust actions across industries. And so I was just curious if there was something about the nature of the platform setting with Microsoft, but they seem to be finding that when competition is reduced, then you get increases in innovation as people shift from price competition to innovation-based competition.
So is this the Kang, the collusion paper? He looks at manufacturing industries, Kang at USC?
Right, yeah.
Yes, so it's very interesting. I actually talked to him over the summer about this. And so he actually said that the data comes from manufacturing. And he found our results very interesting because he said that the data that he has is older. It doesn't have technology-based firms. It doesn't have platform firms, but it has manufacturing firms. And so those are exactly the patterns that I talked earlier in the talk. We know much about what happens in manufacturing, and some of these results are not consistent with what Nick Bloom and the international trade literature find, which is sort of consistent with ours. But like Kang's findings seem to be saying that platform firms, their dominance is good. It is this ordering force, and therefore when you break them up, in this case, in his case, collusion, then actually you're killing innovation. But the bottom line is his data comes from manufacturing, it's not technology. And the big open question that we try to tackle here today is, what happens when you are actually trying to regulate a dominant technology platform. And our results are specific to
Thank
that.
you. I also want to note that Shruti is here. Welcome, and feel free to jump in if you have things you want to add. Let me build a little bit on that last point you made, Riitta, and it's also a question that came up from a few people like Yorgos. This distinction, the goals of antitrust in terms of fostering innovation, but some of the older antitrust was really more focused on lowering prices or getting competition so that consumers had more consumer welfare. And it came up a little bit as you were just discussing the Kong paper. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on those two different goals. I think you quoted Rebecca Henderson talking a bit about innovation as the primary goal. But could you say a little bit about the consumer welfare, especially given that you see the lower profits, and you could imagine a story that's good for consumers, that if less of it is going to the vendors, or if it's just because of wasteful duplicative innovation, then that's not very beneficial. So maybe talk about those dual goals of fostering innovation versus better prices and consumer welfare.
Shruti, do you want to take the first pass?
Yeah, sure. I can take that first part. So yeah, what's interesting in platforms is that pricing becomes a little bit less relevant. So if you want to use a very easy to understand example, think about what's going on with apps, right? A lot of times what platforms do when they bundle something is that they actually make it free to the consumer, right? Because they're just including this functionality. But there's still long-term concern that if the platform is taking more and more of the market, is it going to stifle other firms? Is it going to stifle innovation? So in making these platforms more powerful, maybe from a pricing point of view, things are cheaper for the consumer, but in the long run, you get these monopolies that could potentially be stifling other firms. For us, we don't have pricing data. This is a setting actually where these are very complex contracts where prices are kind of negotiated individually. But we do know that there is some evidence that there at least was a little more competition among firms for big customer contracts. So I looked at analyst calls, for example, where firms talk about contracts that they're landing and who they're hearing about. And so there was a little more kind of buzz in terms of hearing more new names after the case in these analyst calls compared to before. So we don't have quantitative data on that, but we do have some evidence that certainly these actual customer contracts in terms of how fiercely firms had to compete with them was kind of going up after this case.
Yeah, and so just building on that, Maria Savona asks about whether this could be wasteful in terms of leading to wasteful duplication, or is it something that's cheaper for consumers? And I know you did touch on that, but could you say a little bit more about how you can distinguish those interpretations?
And I think just to build on that point, that all of these court cases, all of these cases rely on innovation. So they frequently, Rebecca Henderson, you referred to Rebecca Henderson's comment, the case was never going to be about price because this is software, that this is practically free. So the consumer benefits are elsewhere, and the consumer benefits are in variety and new products. So innovation becomes the main benefit, the main motivator for these cases. Then the idea of the question about wasteful duplication is interesting. So I think that's something that we can actually look at with our data. We haven't yet gotten there, but we could be looking at whether, for example, we get more diversity in patent classes, the data that we have, to see whether we get more ideas or whether everybody is sort of, patenting in the same classes. So that's something interesting that we can definitely look more in detail in the future. But I think the main point is that going back to the first question, how are platforms different? How are technology companies different? They're different because antitrust is not about lowering the price for consumers, and it cannot be. It's certainly more convenient to bundle and get the product easily and with lower price, even free. So these antitrust cases need to be about innovation. And,
Sure.
and that's exactly the point here.
They're about, so should we be thinking that more innovation is always good, or is there a point where, or do people argue that perhaps some of this innovation is, you know, I think you had a quote there about copycat, Me Too innovation that may not add much, even if it adds to R&D and other costs.
So I can say we're at least looking at citation weighted patents, right? So we're not counting all patents as equal. So we're looking at ones that are actually used going forward in terms of developing further patents, right? Certainly we could also think about looking at other measures of innovation in the question of effort. So for example, we know that R&D intensity actually also goes up among what we would call the treated firms, right? So they're also putting more effort into innovation. I think what we would want to do there is maybe shift the time scale a bit, because the tricky thing is this is a sector with fairly long development cycles for products. But, you know, we could potentially be looking at an analysis there as well and see, like, you know, how does this translate into actual product introductions or other kind of beneficial innovations for the market.
Okay. So I see a question here from Russ Siegelman. Sort of a factual question. I don't know if you have this. What happened to Microsoft's enterprise platform market share after the antitrust case?
Sure. So right now they're about 48%. So they didn't really take off the way that they had hoped to do. So they were, at the time of the case, they were at 51%. They had just gotten that majority, and they were, like Riitta mentioned, at least quite a bit ahead of anyone else. But this case also coincided, perhaps also possibly led to Red Hat getting more of a foothold in the space. So if you look at it now, it's about 48% for Microsoft, so still the biggest firm. But then Red Hat also has about a third of the market with its Linux server. So it wasn't at the time important for Microsoft because they saw it as a very big growth industry for them. They had sort of done what they could with the main Windows client, and now this was where they had room to grow. But it didn't. The timing was kind of bad. Just as they got their foothold, the antitrust regulators brought the gavel down.
Mm-hmm. And so is your sense that they would have grown if it hadn't been for the antitrust case?
I think so, because when you look at the complaints that other companies were filing, a lot of it actually was about shenanigans, so to speak, in the server market, where they were doing things like they would make other complements products incompatible with Windows Server, or they would make it so that you had to buy like a third party, a Microsoft like adapter to make their software work. So they were doing things that even like Gartner Research, which is a neutral third party market research firm, was noting that they're making it really difficult for anyone else to actually compete in these certain complementary markets. And so they seem to be trying to use the same tactics in the server space, but then they seem to have been cut off by this antitrust action.
Gotcha. And Sarah Bono would like to ask know a little bit more about the data. Can you describe a little bit some of the control firms that were, broadly similar but not direct competitors for Microsoft versus the ones that were?
Sure. So what we do is we look at the markets in which Microsoft had, a top 5 product versus markets where maybe they had a product, but it was very, very low market share, like 5% or less, and they weren't considered a leading firm. So it would be comparing something like, like Oracle was a direct competitor, right, in database, but then a firm like Symantec was actually not a competitor at the time because Microsoft was not in security yet. Mm-hmm. And so we would try to make them broadly similar in terms of size. So those were both very big firms. We tried to match on geography to control for like regional effects, and then also how long they had been public, since that's shown to be associated with innovation as well. And then we had kind of alternate matching mechanisms too, such as looking at the pre-case innovation level. So how many patents had they been introducing before the case to sort of make it so that they were equally innovative firms as well.
Yeah,
and I think.
Go ahead, Riitta.
And I think part of Sarah's question might have been, how did you make the control for Microsoft? I think I heard that in the question. And so that was done. That was interesting creativity by Shruti by looking at including public IT firms like Intel, because if you're trying to make a case that you have a control firm for Microsoft, you really don't find those firms in the infrastructure software. So we had to go outside the sector and look at big public IT firms. And I think Intel was one of them that ended up in that group of synthetic control firms.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what are your thoughts about the which markets Microsoft decided to enter versus not entering, and insofar as that is sort of an endogenous decision? Could it be that Microsoft chose to enter markets where there was more potential for innovation, and how would, or less potential, I guess more potential? How would that influence your strategy, the control strategy? Do you understand that? Maybe I didn't ask that.
Yeah. I thought about that yesterday, actually. So I didn't show, I should have, Shruti encouraged me to show. I didn't show how, when we did the matching, how that made the firms more comparable. So some of those differences that you just mentioned, Erik, characteristics go away. So we could certainly do some, a two-stage analysis to look at entry to those markets. But I think our causal inference strategy is pretty robust to find comparable firms, which is important for us. And the trends are also in the diff index pretty parallel. And Shruti checked also the parallel trends assumption. So I think we have a pretty good causal inference strategy here, but we're open to more ideas if somebody has them beyond just diff in diff and matching and synthetic controls and everything else, placebo test and all the additional tests that were on the slides that I took away last night. So open to more ideas, Erik, if you're hearing them from the audience.
I think that the risk is that there's some kind of unobserved heterogeneity in that the managers at Microsoft observe some markets that are ripe for innovation, and those are the ones they enter. And then those are the ones you also see more innovation ex post by the competitors, if they have any particular.
Why, Erik, in that case, why would you see that then Microsoft is not getting more innovation in those markets? So if they indeed saw, let's go in because we're going to get more innovation out of this market, but then they don't get the innovation.
That's a very good point. I think that's a very good counter argument to that hypothesis. So I think that's a good argument. Sort of a some ways related question. Frankly, asks about the burst of the dot-com bubble right around the same time and what that may do to incentives for innovation. Again, I think you'd have to tell some story why it would be differential between Microsoft and the others, as you just pointed out. But at that point, there was the crash of Microsoft's stock price, and it might have affected their incentives for innovate, or at least their capacity. Can you say a little bit about that and how you connect that to the other companies' incentives to innovate?
Do you want to tag team? You go first, Shruti.
Sure. So I would say, this is definitely something we're aware of, right? Because in some ways, 2001 is not the ideal treatment year, but there's nothing that indicates, at least to us. So I've done really deep dives into this industry also in terms of qualitative data, right? So I know these firms quite well, and there's nothing that suggests that these markets differed in terms of their sensitivity to the dot-com bubble. It did matter. You do see that their profit dropped around 2000, and then it started to recover. And there doesn't seem a reason for why certain markets would have been more robust, because broadly speaking, they are different market segments within infrastructure software, but there are 5 markets where companies need products from all 5 markets to run their IT systems. And there isn't a reason that one market would somehow be less or more sensitive to this dot-com bubble than the others, basically.
Yeah. And here's another way of slicing it. Jonas asked about the EU versus the United States, and bring it up to the present. How would you see any regulatory breakup in the near future, or relating to, say, Google or AWS, would impact the competitiveness of the relationships between the firms in the US and the EU?
So I think,
go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, so I just happen to be teaching like the Google EU case soon, so this is kind of like fresh in my head. But the EU, I think, the issue with the platform markets over there is one of scale. So, the EU hasn't created Google or anything like that yet. And I think part of it is that you can't scale as quickly over there, and that ends up being so important in platform markets. But there's also a very big difference between how they approach regulation. So the EU is all about dominance in the sense that even someone with 40% could be considered a dominant firm there, right? Whereas here in the US, or maybe I shouldn't say here, I'm in London right now, but in the US, there's a much higher barrier, right? And so you need to be more on the scale of something like Google, where they're looking at like 90% market share. So I think the EU is probably going to be kind of on the forefront of regulatory action against these big firms because they have a lot more kind of leeway to do that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I think just to step back and say, you know, what's the big news story here? I don't think our recommendations are quite in bold type yet. You know, this is a working paper, work in progress, but it seems really innovation. But I think the big question, if we go back to the consumer benefit, is firms don't introduce more products, which is the indicator for the consumers or for these enterprise clients that they are getting more innovation. So why is that? Why are we not getting more products? It's consistent with the wasteful duplication arguments that you know someone suggested, Maria suggested in the beginning here of Q&A. So I think it's interesting. So what do we tell regulators? We get more patents, but not more products. So is patents good enough? I don't know. I think it's an interesting question.
Well, I'll just double down on that. I mean, one of the upvoted questions here was from Sam Gockenheimer. He was at Microsoft since 2003 up to this year, and says that around 2014, they really reduced their focus on patents. And in his view, innovation went way up. So, you know, what do you think about other metrics of innovation and whether patents is the right way, or the strengths and weaknesses of patents as innovation? I mean, you already touched on it some, but maybe either of you could say more on that.
Shruti has spent her life on this, multiple years. You should answer this question.
Sure. So software patents. So our time period is at a time where patenting started to become the dominant method of at least IP protection in software. So there were some important court cases in the late 1990s. And certainly at the time, talking to people who were executives and VCs at these firms at that time, patents were actually seen as important, not just in terms of protecting innovation, but also in terms of like kind of sending positive signals about like how innovative you were as a company. Now, it wouldn't surprise me that maybe that relationship weakened over time. So I think maybe we've chosen like a good time period to look at this. But again, we do have other measures of innovation that we'll look into a bit more. The good thing about my data is actually I do have like descriptions of all these products as well, so that it's tricky to just look at product counts, but potentially with this smaller sample size, we only have 78 firms, we could also start looking at things like the products as they're described, the product features, performance metrics for some of them. So that could, you know, that would be another kind of data coding effort, but we do have kind of the underlying data for that.
That'd be great. We're just about out of time. Let me just take the last minute. There's a couple of questions. I'll just lump them together about generalizing your results. So maybe it's a good one to end on. You know, how comfortable would you feel generalizing these to other areas like Samsung and LG that are appliance products, or in telecom or other areas? Several different questions. Or should we think about this mostly focusing on platforms and software platforms?
I would focus mostly on software platforms, given the results from manufacturing and public utilities, et cetera, that we talked about in the beginning, which don't show as consistent of a pattern. So I would say that there's plenty for regulators who are regulating dominant tech platforms right now if they go through our results.
Great.
So
well,
I'll leave it there.
A lot of time. There are some more questions. I hope we can capture those so you can take a look at them and help you in your as you revise and update this work in progress. Is there, or will there soon be a paper available for the participants to read, and or can we have them look at the PowerPoint slides?
Of course, I will be in touch to give both. Absolutely.
Okay. Post them on the website. Thank you so much, Riitta and Shruti. Thanks for joining us. That was terrific, really interesting work. And I want to let everyone know that our next digital lunch seminar is going to be Liran Anav speaking in 2 weeks. So I think that's the 30th. So hope to see you all then. Thank you very much for joining us. See you.
Thanks. Bye.